So I have another DIY project for you. This time, I need to make a stuff sack for my 16 centimeter zebra billy pot. You're interested in seeing how I make my stuff sacks? Stay tuned. So before we get started on this specific project, I just want to talk about how I design my stuff sacks to start with. So here is my 12 centimeter zebra billy pot in a stuff sack that I made for it some time ago. The reason, of course, I do, well, let's just show you the reason I do. That's about a 5-year-old zebra billy pot, and I occasionally wipe it down, but I never scrub it off to get it down to bare metal again. So they can get a little bit dirty, and if you're just coming out of the woods or just haven't used it over a fire, they can be quite dirty. It's not something I want to drop into my backpack and get soot all over everything else. So a stuff sack makes a reasonable thing to do. In addition, you know, stuff sacks are one of those things that you can have your odds and ends from your cooking kit or whatever that are inside the pot. If you want to keep them organized, just throw them back in the stuff sack while the pot's being used. All right, so how I design my stuff sack. So there's a couple different designs, but for something that is taller than it is wide across the base, I go with what I call a tubular stuff sack, and it has a round base on it. That's a little bit more complicated than just a square or rectangular stuff sack, and I'll give you an idea of what I'm talking about. You can see hopefully where I sewed a circular base onto this, and that's the stuff sack we're going to design today. It's a little bit more involved than a rectangular one, but it's not all that difficult if we break it down into a step-by-step process. So let's do that. Okay, to begin, we're going to break this project down into two major pieces. First will be the circular base, and then we'll build the sidewall that will attach to the base. So to begin, what you need is a few measurements. So I'm going to take my zebra billy pot. Now I know this is a 16 centimeter pot, but that's the internal diameter of the pot itself. What you want is to get the maximum width that you would have to deal with on this. Now, I'm not going to measure the included handle for this project, and I'll explain why in a minute, but what I am going to measure is how wide it is right across here, because that's a little bit wider than the internal diameter. And with a zebra billy pot, of course, they come with the little pan, plate, fry pan, whatever you like to use these for. Some people turn them into steamers. So that's what I'm going to use, because the lip on the outside of this, it represents the widest point on the pot. I'm going to lay that down on a piece of paper, and for this demonstration, and I'm going to draw it. Now this is just reference only so that I can keep a track of my measurements. So I'm going to measure that across, and that can be a little bit challenging to find the exact diameter, but I am going to measure this, and I'll do it in inches rather than centimeters. And it is just shy of 6 3/4 inches. It's always better to up the measurement a tiny bit rather than underestimate, because a little extra room in the bag is not a bad thing. So 6.75 inches. Now there's a couple of different ways I could have done this. I could have held the ruler right on the pot and gotten that measurement. That would work also. And I think you may have seen this in other videos that I've done. This is called a center finder. It's a really unique device, very inexpensive plastic with a lot of measurements and holes all on top of it. It is great for finding not only the center, but also the size of an item. So I can do it one of two ways. And by the way, somebody did ask, I picked this up at Lee Valley here in Canada. You can order it online. We happen to have a Lee Valley outlet in Halifax, so I was able to go out and pick this up. Actually, I didn't pick this up at all. This was a gift, Christmas gift, small one from some friend. And I could have done it this way. I could have laid the pot down, and it is telling me it's just between 6.5 and 6 3/4 inch. So like I said, I'm going to upgrade to 6 3/4 inch. So that's a couple of different ways I could have done that measurement. Now, I wrote it down in a circle because I need that reference. So there is my reference. Hopefully you can see that. I may have to darken that in with marker for you to see, but trust me, I've got a 6 3/4 inch circle on this piece of paper. Now, I have to make a couple of decisions. First off, I could make a bag 6 3/4 inches in diameter when it's finished, but that's going to be awfully tight for getting this pot in and out of. I want a little slack, a little room on each side of the pot. So I have to decide just how much room do I want. A little bit big is not bad. You don't want it too big, but you don't want it too tight. So what I'd like to have is I like to have an inch total space, meaning a ½ inch all the way around the outside. So that adds an inch to the diameter of the circle, and that will give me the finished inside diameter of the bag. So rather than 6 3/4, that's now going to tell me it's going to be 7 3/4 inches finished. I'm writing that down. All right, that's good to know, but in order to make this work, we have to sew onto that outside diameter, which means you need yet a bigger circle, and we call, now, I have to tell you right up front, I am not a seamstress. I have not a lot of experience sewing, but I have picked up some lessons, mostly through trial and error, and that's what I'm trying to share with you today. So I need a circle bigger than 7 3/4 inches, and it's good to have at least a ½ inch seam allowance, as it's known, all the way around the outside. So that's adding 1 more inch to 7.75 or 7 3/4 for a total of 8.75 inches. Now, how am I going to get a circle 8.5 inches or 8 3/4 inches? You could draw this with a compass on paper. That works fine. If you're trying to do this on fabric, which we will be in a few minutes, it's very difficult to hold the fabric still to do that. So what I do is go around the house looking for a pot, a pan, or a plate or something like that, which will have a diameter very close to what I want. And that's what I have. This is one of our dessert plates from our kitchen set. And I measured this out, and it comes in just under 9 inches. So it's not going to fit on this paper, but trust me when I say it's just under 9 inches. And that's the circle I'm going to draw on my fabric. So let's do that. Okay, here's the piece of fabric that I'm going to use to cut the circle off. I just cut this, it's approximately 10 or 11 inch square piece of fabric off a used piece of fabric. Now the fabric I got is a synthetic, heavy-duty nylon type fabric, something you might cover furniture with, and it's quite a durable piece. I got this at a thrift store here in Halifax. They have a fabrics or materials section for people that donate, usually offcuts from projects. And I go through once in a while and I have a look, and I'll find materials which are the right color, nothing too outrageous, something that looks kind of subtle, something that would look good as a piece of woods gear. And I come up with a piece that was approximately 3 feet long, or 3 feet wide by about 12 feet long. I think it may have been a heavy duty curtain material. And I got it for $3, and that's going to afford me a lot of material for a lot of projects. So here's the material I'm going to use. And this is the diameter of my base, as I mentioned, just under 9 inches. This I'm going to mark with a Sharpie so you can see it. So there's my circle. Now, I'm going to cut that out. By the way, if you have a good pair of scissors, and I mean a good sharp pair of scissors, this is where they come in handy. I suppose you could try this with a knife. I've found varying results from cheaper pair of scissors. A good pair of scissors, something that a seamstress would use, is very valuable at this point. So I'm going to cut that out and then we'll come back. Okay, as you can see, the circle all cut out. It looks huge in relationship to the pot itself. It's a good just over an inch, not much, but a little bit over an inch larger all the way around. But that includes the space that I want down the sides and the seam allowance. And it occurs to me I should probably give an example of what I mean by seam allowance. So this is the bag that I have my 12 centimeter zebra billy pot kept in. I've turned it inside out, and you can see why I carry it in a bag, because they will get dirty on the inside. There's the base. Now you can see this part standing up all the way around. That's the seam allowance. If I were to flatten that out as best I can for the camera, you can see that it's a half inch larger than the sew line is. That's the seam allowance. You need that space to have something that you can put pins through and sew when you attach it to the sidewall. So that's what I'm talking about. There's also a seam allowance on the sidewall, but we'll get to that in a minute. All right, so that's the design. Now, that was the easy part. This is where the math begins. We're going to have to decide how long a piece of material we want to go around and how tall we want it to be. So let's design that. Okay, so the next step is to create the sidewall. That's the side of the stuff sack. So that's a two-part process. First thing we have to know is how much material is it going to take to go around the outside of the pot with that seam allowance. We'll talk about that again in a second. Also, we need to know how tall to make that piece of material. So working with the measurements that I know already from drawing the base, we know that the base is going to be 7.75 inches finished because the pot was 6.75 and we wanted to give it a ½ inch all the way around for a total of 1 inch addition, so 7.75. And if I do the math using pi, which is 3.14, I'll get a measurement very close to 27.5 inches. So you can see that's quite a long piece of material already. But in addition to that, I have to allow for a seam allowance on either end. So when I bring the sides together, I'll have some material to sew along. So it's going to come out to a total of 28.5 inches. Now I'm going to show this in a diagram in a second, but just remember that's a total of 28.5 inches to go around the pot and to give me the seam allowance to sew it together. Now, how tall do I want to make it? Well, I'll need the measurement of the height. So if I measure the height from the bottom of the pot to the top of the lid, I get 7.5 inches. Yeah, 7.5 inches right to the top of the lid right here. So 7.5 inches, but the material has to be taller than that if we want it to come together in the center. So you would need at least half of that diameter added to the height to bring the material together. So we know it's 6.75 or just about 7 inches, so we could say 3.5 inches added to the 7.5, sorry, height. And that would give us just enough material to touch in the center. But of course we have to allow for the channel. So a little extra material has to be added to create the channel. So we recommend, or I'm recommending, a 1 inch piece of material, because you'll sew along about a 1/4 inch of that, giving you a channel that's 0.75 inches or 3/4 of an inch wide. So that means adding 1 more inch to that. But if you want any slack at all, any room in the top of the bag, you'll have to add that to that measurement. So I decided that I did want some extra room inside of that, and I'll show you what I came up with. So here's a diagram. Let's see if I can get it all in frame here. Here's a diagram of the piece of material that I want to use, and I want to make sure you can see this, so I'll bring it in just close enough. So I know that it's going to be 28.5 inches across. Oops, sorry. 28.5 inches across in this diameter, and it needs to be 14.75 inches tall because I want 6 inches of material above the top of the pot, and plus that 1 inch. So 6 inches of material to give me more than just meat in the center. I want a little bit of slack at the top of the pot as well. So that means I need to cut a piece of material 28.5 by 14.75. So I've done that just to save a little bit of time. So here's my material. Now let me just back out on the camera so you can see what I've done to the material. All right, I backed out a little bit so I can get almost all the material at least in frame anyway. So here's my material, 28.5 inches in this diameter, 28.5 inches long by 14.75 inches tall. Now you can see that I've drawn some lines on. So the first line I've drawn is 2 inches down from the top, and the reason that line is drawn there is that gives me something to fold over and match along a 1 inch wide channel here. So I'm going to be pinning that down, and I'll do that in a few minutes time. I also have on the rest of the material a 1/2 inch wide line all the way along, and that's my seam allowance for sewing. So I think we talked about seam allowance, but just quickly again, the seam allowance is what is necessary when you're bringing two pieces of material together so that you can pin it and sew it. So it's necessary to have a little bit, and a 1/2 inch is what I like to use, and it works out pretty good for me. Okay, so just a quick point on the marks that I have on my material. So I'm using a Sharpie pen, a navy blue Sharpie pen, mostly so that you can see it, and also because it's what's available to me. Alternatively, if you want to use what professional seamstresses use, they have it called a material chalk. And it comes either in a colored pencil type of material or a little square that has a sharp edge on it. And it's a type of a chalk. To me, it feels more like soap than chalk. But you can run a line along, and then that's your measurement line, and it will rub right off over time. If not, it will certainly wash off. I'm not too concerned about these lines showing, because all the work that I'm going to do, once this is put together, all those drawn lines are going to be on the inside of the bag. Now, most of them should be covered up by the sewing anyway. But if you want to make sure that none of your lines show, draw them all on what will end up being the inside of the bag. And I'll explain what I mean by that as we go along. So my next step is to fold this over, pin it down, and I'm going to, before I sew it, I'll show you what I've done with the pinning. Now, just a little trick I've learned from working with material. Some material you can fold over and kind of press it with your hands and it will stay there. Not this material. It wants to unfold itself. So one of the things I've learned is that if I iron that down, it'll keep a crease and makes that a lot easier for pinning. So just a word on pinning, and you'll see this when I'm finished. Don't be stingy. Use as more pins than you think. This is probably the most monotonous part of the whole process, is the pinning process. But trust me, the more time you take doing a good job of pinning it up, the better the end product will be. So I'm going to pin that down, and then I'll bring it back and show you what I've done. All right, I have my material folded down. So it's got to fold 1 inch down from the top. Remember, this is going to be the channel for the drawstring. I have pins placed along its entire length, approximately 1 inch apart. Take your time, do a good job pinning, because it's going to make a lot of difference when you go to sew this together. So a couple things I didn't mention or at least one thing I didn't mention before. The material that I'm using is a great material for working with because it doesn't fray. And what I mean by that is a lot of material, the material will just start fraying off in the ends and it will just start coming away from it. If you have material like that, one of the things you can do, well, there's two things, I guess. One of the things you can do is kind of make a fold and then make another fold so the raw edge is covered on the inside. You'll have to allow for that in your measurements if that's the way you're going to do. It is an extra step, but it does make it look neater and it does prevent the fraying. The other thing you can do, it's not something I do often, it's something my wife showed me at one point, is right along the edge when you do your sewing, use a zigzag motion, and that will resist fraying past the zigzag. It's not something I often do. If I'm really concerned about the material fraying, I'll fold and fold again, and that will make sure that it doesn't fray out. All right, so that's all pinned up. Now, I am going to sew this on my sewing machine, or my wife's sewing machine. I am not going to show the process of using the sewing machine for a couple of reasons. One, there's no question that this sewing machine is probably different than your sewing machine if you have access to a sewing machine. So any skill that I show you on how to set up and do the sewing here would make a lot of sense in the sense that it would be different on your machine. The other thing is, you don't really need a sewing machine to do this. If you've got some patience, you can do this by hand. You can just sew along. It take a little longer, take a lot longer, but it's entirely possible that you can sew this entire project by hand and do a very good job at it at that. So I'm just going to take a minute, I'll sew this together, and I'll show you what the next step is. Okay, there's my material with the channel that the drawstring will go through, all sewn on. Nice and straight, or fairly straight, as straight as I can make it anyway. Okay, here's where the fun begins. How do I take this rectangular piece of material and sew it to an edge of a circle? Well, it's a little bit of a daunting process. It's not all that difficult, but it does require patience. You can start anywhere on the circle. You take the edge of the circle and you match it to the edge of the material, hold it in position, drive a pin through. Now make sure when you're doing this that your seam allowance is on top, that you can see your seam allowance, the line you drew that you're going to be sewing along. So that's where the sewing is going to be. So you're going to pin so that it crosses that seam allowance at 90 degrees. My experience tells me, take your time, make sure you line up along the edge and pin every 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch. And yeah, that is a lot of pinning, but it makes a difference in trying to get this on there correctly. The material is going to want to pull this way, so you're going to be curving it around, basically a straight edge. You're going to be curving it around. the edge of a circle. It will work for you. Just take your time and pin it on. It will take a bit of time for me to do this, so I'm going to pin it on. But before I sew it, I want to show you what it looks like with the pins on. So stand by for that. Okay, just before I show you what I've done, I have to show you a mistake I made. So, there's a saying in carpentry, which is measure twice, cut once. And that applies to working with fabric as well. So this is the diagram I showed you a few minutes ago. And I had said that the length of the material needed to be 28.5 inches. And that 28.5 inches was based on, at least what I said, was based on pi times the finished diameter of the bag. The finished diameter of the bag is supposed to be 7.75 inches. That's not, when you multiply 7.75, it doesn't come out to 28.5. What I used was the complete circle diameter of 8.5 inches. So 8.5 inches comes out to, well, it's just short of 27.75 inches, or 27.5 inches. And then I added the 1 inch for the seam allowance on either side. So what ended up happening is, as I pinned around, instead of coming precisely to, I'm 1 inch longer. Now, if you're going to make a mistake, that's the type of mistake you want to make. You want to end up with more material than you needed, not less. So I have 1 inch more material going around the outside, but that's easy enough to correct at this point because I'm going to sew with that allowance 1 inch on one side and 1/2 inch on the other side, and it will work. All right, I'll say that again in a second, but I just want to show you where I'm at. So this was the time-consuming piece of the work, where I pinned the rectangle to the circle, and you can see how it turns out. Sewing this is also a bit of a challenge because you have to sew along the line that I've drawn here. It just takes a little time, and you have to move it very slowly, a little bit at a time as you rotate it on the sewing machine, and that'll bring it together. So that is my next step. I'm going to sew around here, and I'll remove the pins, and then we'd be almost finished. I have to sew up the side. All right, and if I haven't mentioned this before, I believe I have, but it's always worth mentioning again. Make sure as you do this that everything is done inside out. This is eventually going to be on the inside. This seam here is going to be the inside, and so is the fold-over seam for the drawstring. You want everything on the inside. I have the seam that's running up the side. You can see now we're getting very close to a finished shape. I have the seam that's running up the side all pinned ready to sew. And I wanted to show again the mistake that I made so you can understand why it happened. I have too much material right along here for that seam allowance, and that was because I used the wrong math in multiplying the diameter of the circle instead of the finished circle that I wanted. But it worked out for me that I have a little bit more material than I need, and I'll sew that on, and then I can always cut off the excess material. So once I get this sewn on, we're just about finished. There's just a couple of very small things to do, and I'll show you what those are, and then we'll put the drawstring in it, drop the pot in it, and we'll call it good. All right, stand by. Okay, essentially the bag is finished. What I wanted to show you that were two small things I said. One is the bag is still inside out. When you turn the bag right side out, the seam allowance is going to fold in and around, and then it's going to be like this, and I'll show you what I mean. What I do is I cut a small notch right there at the top, not crossing over any of the sewing so it doesn't come unraveled, but it's just a small notch there, and you'll see why in a second. It makes it much easier to thread the cord through. The other thing that I did is where the seam allowance had been sewn down the side, and yes, I trimmed it off, I then had to fold it back onto the seam allowance that goes around the base and just quickly stitch across there. Now, just a word on stitching, something I didn't mention but is well worth knowing. One of the things I do when I get to points that I consider are going to be high stress or areas where it might come unraveled is you go back and forth with the sewing machine 2 or 3 times. It just creates a locking stitch, and it makes it much stronger, much less likely to become undone. So what I have is a piece of paracord all ready to go, and a piece of wire. I call this a fish. It's just a piece of light wire folded over. I'll feed that through the hole, or through the channel at the top. You can see what I'm doing here. And just kind of bunch it all up on the wire all the way around. Now you can see the end came out at the far end of the channel. Put a paracord through that little loop. Give it a little bit of material there. Squeeze it shut a little bit so it doesn't come off halfway through. And start it in through the channel. Grab the other end where I started at. And just slowly pull the rope through. Takes a little bit sometimes to get it started. There we go. And it came out through. There we go. So now I have my cord pass through the channel. And what I'm going to use is just a bead. Just a small bead. You could use a cord lock. You can use any number of different things, I suppose. That provides tension to hold it shut. I'm going to put that on and we'll wrap this video up. Okay, there's the finished product. It's a little bit bigger than it needed to be for this 16 centimeter zebra billy pot. I added extra length to the top. It came right up over top of the handle. You know, it doesn't have to be that long. I did want it a little taller than just to the top of the pot, and that's what I ended up with. It's probably a little bit bigger than I needed to be for this pot, but a little bit big is better than a little bit small. I'll show you a picture on the bottom where the seam allowance gave me the slack around the sides. There's the sewing up the side. Everything went together nice, just a little bit bigger than I probably wanted for this project, but that's okay. All right, that's another DIY project out of the way. If you're interested in seeing more projects like this or other video projects, you may consider subscribing to my channel. But in the meantime, get out and explore. Take the path less traveled. It will make all the difference. Bye for now.